Hi, Alex Williams of the New Stack here for show 55, the New Stack Analysts, that we did at OSCON. Joining us were co-host Donnie Berkholz of 451 Research, Mike Amundsen, API architect who works at CA Technologies in the API Academy, and Adrian Cockcroft of Battery Ventures. Enjoy the show. You are listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast. Each week, we discuss our latest data research and a topic related to app development and back-end services. Our show this week is brought to you by Pivotal. Pivotal is on a mission to modernize IT. They have a portfolio of applications which include Cloud Foundry, Redis, RabbitMQ, and Spring. They're a steward of open source. You can find them at pivotal.io. Now let's get to the show.
So when are you going to form the New Stack Foundation?
I was asking him, I was joking about that the other day.
Not compete with the Cloud Data Foundation.
There has to be at least one more company that comes out with a new stack. Then you can start a foundation.
Right.
So it's just one, there's no foundation.
Right.
One more. As soon as there's one more, we got to quickly.
Well, there is another one, right? There's the other. It's called. Well, there's the stack, and then there's the platform or whatever.
Yeah.
It is, right?
Oh, really?
Right,
So
right.
I'm so out of it. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
foundation.
And there's Derek Harris's thing, Scale.
Right, and we're putting our ebook series on GitHub, so maybe we'll see it get forked or whatever. So we talked a lot about foundations, but I guess more. I'm interested in the story behind this. What's the story behind all this stuff, right? What are the reasons for these things? What is happening in the market right now that leads us to this place? So I'm curious in just the dynamic forces. Not as much the foundations themselves, but Kubernetes has gained a lot of momentum. Docker has had a lot of momentum, but now they seem to be somewhat exposed with the OCI, but maybe not. Maybe this is just their best way to embrace the community. So I'm just curious in your guys' perspectives on that.
Yeah, the thing that I find really interesting about this whole foundation is, the low barriers to entry for starting new foundations now lets you do sort of this agile foundation approach, right? Like we can now experiment with foundations in a way that we couldn't before because you've got, like the Linux Foundation providing sort of foundation as a service, right? It's still not cheap, as I understand it, but it's lowered the barrier. As soon as you get some corporate sponsorship involved, suddenly you can say, new foundation here, new foundation there. Lets you test out a lot of the different models for, how to collaborate under some kind of vendor-neutral aegis.
So the Open Foundation is next.
Exactly.
Right? Got to open source the how to build foundations.
So we're abstracting this whole thing, right, into a service. We're
I think
automating
so.
it.
Well, it lets us figure out, what's the best model for these foundations, right? Is it entirely corporate-driven? Is it entirely individual-driven, like Apache style? Or is it sort of somewhere in the middle? Or maybe there's something we haven't thought about yet. Maybe you could run it like an OSI-type model, right? And have a foundation that's individual membership-based.
There are a lot of new foundations, but they're actually all most of them are associated with some existing foundation entity, right? They're not a brand new standalone thing. And so it's definitely an anti-pattern to create your own thing from scratch. Having it be run by Linux or Apache or something like that seems to be the right way to do it.
Yeah. And is foundation now a replacement for shared standard?
It should be working groups, is that what we used to call it?
Right, yeah. So is it not? It's not the WC3. It's not the IETF, right? These things are not happening in that area. What does that mean? Is that
fundamentally, there's two ways to build a standards body or a standards group. You can make them easy to join and great for marketing, or hard to join and good for building standards and products. And so if you have too many people joining, you end up with this unwieldy thing that can't actually make decisions and get stuff done, but it's great for marketing because everyone joined it, so everyone sticks the brand in. So I think what you're seeing here is, to some extent, sort of marketing-related ones. The ones where they announce we have everyone joined, right? Well, you could have just done the stuff, right? What you're actually seeing here is people that own open source projects going, everyone else going, well, we don't like it that you're the owner of this project. We want this to not, want Kubernetes to not be a Google project. We want Docker to not be a Docker project, the container thing. We want someone else to own it so that we feel more comfortable about that. That's really why the code is being donated to the foundation. It's because there's now a business barrier to further adoption of that code as a thing, right? So they want the ownership to be explicitly handed off to someone else. And when I was at Netflix, we had people come say, you should make all the Netflix OSS stuff into a foundation. We're just not really interested in that. It doesn't meet any of our needs as Netflix to go do that. But
there wasn't this effort around APIs, when there was like such an interest in APIs around 2006, 2007. We saw there's been so much innovation over the past 5 to 10 years. Which without the need for all these foundations, without the need for all these organizations.
I think it's the growth of open standards being the way you do product now. If you're going to build a successful new product, it has to be open source, and that open source has to be at some level unencumbered by, ownership by somebody that might be your competitor. People are more comfortable, so that's the pattern.
Yeah, so you sort of mentioned it's a barrier of entry for the market, or it's a barrier of growth for the market, unless there's a foundation. It's sort of the point of view, right? That I need to hand this off to somebody else in order to grow my market.
Yeah.
Right? So you might say that, well, for Docker to actually grow its market, it needs to give up its code. Right?
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty radical idea, right? And as a matter of fact, doesn't this open container thing challenge Docker's market? Right? It used to be like I host in Docker, right? Now that's not going to be the case.
In some respects it does. I mean, I've heard from multiple people that it creates some exposure for them.
Yeah, I mean, you're creating some exposure because you no longer control the thing, right? But you're gambling that you're now going to be the ecosystem is going to grow faster and bigger. So you end up with, rather than 100% control of a small ecosystem, you become a dominant player in a much bigger ecosystem.
Right. So I think that's one of these things. Do all these foundations actually signal evidence that, wow, this could be a big market? And that's why we have the Cloud Foundry thing. That's why we have all these foundations. Is actually, I think there's going to be a bigger market here.
Well, with your venture capital hat on, what do you think are the ramifications for this?
I have this strange thing. It's like I'm Switzerland for these things. So I've pretty much been invited to join all of them.
Yeah.
as an individual, and I'm not sure if I'm interested to know whether people think it's actually something that be useful. Should I go joining these foundations? I don't know. I've worked on standards bodies before, and it's mostly about. There's a little bit of technical decision making, but it really comes down to politics and marketing and maneuvering. And I think in some sense, it's better to be watching it from the sidelines where I can sort of poke at it a bit more. But
is it much of a bellwether for you as a venture firm? Like, do you sort of take note? Does it actually indicate any sort of growth ideas? Right?
Yeah, I mean, so there's me personally, and I'm not a normal VC firm person. I'm not writing checks to people. I'm associated. I'm in a firm that does that. I can talk more generally about how the VC industry looks at this, which is, if you've invested in a company, then the growth of the ecosystem they're playing in is what drives the growth of that company. So the value of a company, the value of Docker is bigger if it is the majority part of a massive ecosystem rather than owning a smaller ecosystem. So that makes sense. Now, it doesn't really apply to Google because Google is already a big public thing and it's as a side project for them. But if you have a startup that's trying to establish itself as a standard, then having everyone else in the industry pile into their ecosystem is potentially a good thing. But what you're looking for is, can you take this idea and turn it into a repeatable sale in some sense that you can monetize, and you're in a competitive situation. You've got to find a market for the thing you've invested in, and you're looking for what growth can you get. What kind of exit are you going to get from that in a few years' time is ultimately that's what VC is about.
Right, absolutely. Do you think this sort of messes with the first mover theories at all? In other words, is Docker sort of just going to be the major player, or does that also expose them? When you create a foundation, suddenly some whippersnapper can come in and take most of the real estate. Or
if you don't execute that, yeah, sure, you've got to stay on top of it.
But that's no different than really anything else, right? It's not like it's not unusual here.
Yeah, well, I mean, like containers or VMs or whatever. Like, when has the first mover ever won in those areas? Right? Like, everybody's always picking the examples of, like, how about FreeBSD jails? Why didn't they win, or why didn't LXC win, or why didn't OpenVZ win? I mean, they were all in some way the first movers, or even companies around some of them.
Yeah,
and none of them would be perceived as like the dominant market force at this point in time.
Or even Erlang, right? Yeah. Erlang was containers in 1980, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody thinks of it that way.
Well, no, I mean, and like every time I can be like, let's go a little bit farther back, right? Like, how about IBM mainframes? I mean, containers in the 60s.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
And are they the dominant market force today with containers? No. I mean, they're there. They're back again in a new generation in a slightly different form.
So, but getting back to like the user and how they're, and how they're building things these days, it's all kinds of an assortment of things increasingly, right? You're trying different things all the time. Kelsey Hightower talks about this. He's like, it's not just, this whole idea of the full stack developer is questionable sometimes because of just the kind of technologies that everyone is using is just such a mix of them. The question I have is like, what does that mean then if all these users are trying to do things all the time? What is the importance of these foundations? I mean, if there's just going to be not one kind of clear kind of technology platform, but it's just kind of like this splintering of all these different technologies.
I think as users, it's confusing and it's moving very quickly, and you're starting to see companies who are forming to just basically say, we're going to try and deal with this confusion for you, right? So that we're trying to gather it together. To some extent, you can see some of the more opinionated PaaS platforms you're buying into this set of opinions, a sort of straitjacket PaaS versus a pile of parts, right? You can look at AWS as a loose pile of parts that you can assemble into a platform. And then the Netflix approach was to sort of add more parts, so it's a loose pile of things. You can take various bits of it and say, this is my platform. But it's not nearly as opinionated as the Cloud Foundry or OpenShift or whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, what we have seen, though, is like finding that middle ground between those two. Mm-hmm. Right? Like the Google App Engine Managed VMs, for example. Right? Where you've got opinion, and they give you their opinion, but it's still flexible, right? You can still do a little bit of mixing and matching without having to compose everything yourself from scratch. And so, it's like, if you dive into a new code base, it's a lot easier to edit some existing code than it is to write your own brand new code that fits into there, because you've already got something to build on. You've got a framework that you can just, make minor changes to and say like, oh, well, because I don't know Go very well personally, but I can edit Go, and it'll still run. It won't be the best edited Go that's out there. I think that's where, there is this middle ground of being able to get opinions from people who know the stuff really well. But then you can have companies that aren't technology companies and haven't yet figured out their software companies, still able to do some interesting things and have some flexibility when they might not have the technological expertise to build up the best possible solution from scratch or the time.
Yeah, I think the thing I've said about what Docker did, and I said this about a year ago, was it took the platform as a service market and somewhat commoditized it to say you're basically a Docker runtime. There's lots of varieties of it, but if you look at a lot of companies now, their pitch is, I can run Docker better than them, right? And that's, you can sort of distill down, that's it. Because if you're producing containers as the output of your development process, then how are you going to put them in production? That's the question. And who is going to manage that? And is that you're going to run it on Kubernetes, or you can run it just on Mesos using one of the Mesos schedulers? Because now Kubernetes and Mesos used to be sort of equivalents, I thought. They was kind of both trying to be the Borg, right? The Google Borg for everyone else. But now it turns out Kubernetes is sort of repositioned to be a scheduler running on top of Mesos, mostly, although there's more overlap there. Whereas there are already other schedulers on Mesos. So you can see, you can either have a specific type of scheduler for a specific kind of application. Like there's a scheduler for running Hadoop, there's one for running Cassandra, one for running Elasticsearch or something, or you can run Kubernetes, which is a more generic scheduler for running arbitrary applications. And it seems like that hasn't really played out yet. But I think that's where they ended up. But I was confused for a while because I thought that Mesos and Kubernetes were sort of competitors.
Right.
Now
Mesos and Marathon.
But yeah,
Right.
it's now Kubernetes and Marathon are the competitors.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Cloud Foundry talks about right now too. So they want to sort of push this plug-in idea, right? So I'll plug in my scheduler, hosting the schedule. I think that may be the new ground that people are going to be digging up. It's like, and again, are we sort of leveling up? Are we adding layers? Are we, this is sort of the challenge. But I think that's kind of where I think you're right in the sense that okay, it's a container. What's next?
Yeah.
And then what's next right now, the sort of the proprietary pattern is scheduler, and I have to have all these schedulers, but maybe now can we abstract that? So can we standardize the scheduler pattern, right? I think that may be an area that could be interesting that I'd be taking a look at.
I used to do some HPC stuff probably 15 years ago, and it's like exactly the same thing happening all over again. Like back then it was PBS and Torque, and then there were sort of meta schedulers built on top of the schedulers, right? Yeah. Like I'm trying to remember, there's one called like Moab or Maui, which are still around.
It's Rux and Grid Engine and
so,
all these systems, yeah.
Like everybody's always like, how do we move a level up the stack when this open source alternative comes into the market, at our level, right? So like, what's next after all these schedulers? There's going to be some kind of like meta scheduler, some smart resource manager that just does a little bit more.
Yep.
The thing that I'm still disappointed at is that a lot of this is still focused on solving the data center problems because there's still this big mess in the data center, and OpenStack was trying to clear up some of the mess. And now the real question is, okay, we have those southbound controlling all the devices APIs, sort of everyone agreed it's called OpenStack, whatever that means. But the northbound APIs that applications run against has been pretty immature and has taken a long time to come along. So now people are saying, well, maybe if you put Kubernetes on top of OpenStack, you've given the developers something they can program to or whatever. And the thing is that these things tend to be relatively small scale, and they tend to deal with one data center at a time. And you're effectively built a system that manages one zone on AWS to that kind of equivalence. And it doesn't really know that there's another zone or there's another region. And what's missing is this federation, this ability to have the logical equivalent of an AWS account or a public cloud account that actually is global, and then you can deploy things from a single API endpoint in all these different regions and zones. And that hasn't really happened yet. I think there's an interesting. Maybe they're so busy trying to make one data center work that the idea of trying to coordinate 20 of them is just like,
Actually, that's actually an area that our group's been talking a lot about internally, and I'm really kind of with you on that. I think we've gotten so excited about the machine level and now the data center level. That's great, but we keep ignoring the application level or the large-scale distributed level. And one of the things you talk so much about in just general is how DevOps helps you to automate things away. We tend to talk about it as reduce cost, increase speed, improve resiliency, and enable visibility. This is something that we've learned a lot. And you've talked about the visibility issues once you get it sort of above the pile. Like, how can we get a better sense of the distributed visibility? I think the distributed sense and all of that, how do I do good discovery? How do I do good resiliency? How do I start to have that sort of virtual or web level Amazon account? And I don't see people getting aggressive about that.
I think it's on the Mesos roadmap to figure out how to do multiple data centers, and it's something that Jeff Arnold, who's working on OpenStack at Cisco, I think, he's been talking about how do you federate OpenStacks together, because you don't want to run. Right? Well, you don't want to. Well, it's the federation of the control plane, which is a tricky problem, and it's something. A bunch of the AWS outages in 2011 were caused by the control plane federation not having enough isolation in it.
Wasn't this the original dream of OpenStack to be this whole federated infrastructure too, and never could?
To some extent, but I think they did have that dream. But then when they tried to install it, they found it was too hard. So a bunch of decisions were made a year or two ago to simplify the way OpenStack works because it was too hard to make it work. And decisions were made to do things which made it effectively create single points of failure So you end up creating a smaller domain, but it makes it more installable and manageable. But you still then have this problem of if you want to build a really big distributed system that has lots of zones effectively in it, there isn't the concept there of having this hierarchy of regions and zones is kind of missing at the moment.
Where do you marry this idea that you're talking about with the new advent of like these fully, built-in back-end as a service technologies? We see with AWS Lambda to some extent. We ran there's Parse, right? Firebase, right? Yeah. We ran a post today or yesterday about this, where the writer presents the argument that AWS really isn't prepared for this. They don't have the same they don't have the same sophistication in their technology as a Parse or a Firebase.
I think that was that they weren't. What you were basically saying in that post was that they weren't the front-end UI developer and mobile developers have their own kind of world, and AWS is a little bit more back-end focused.
I'm curious about the marriage of these two kind of concepts, right? Because what you're talking about is a better, this interconnected data center world, right? With Mesos is trying to achieve it to some extent. And then we have these front-end developer worlds, right, where we're like these just very quick to build applications, but to me, there's like this big middle. And that's something where I'm curious about. What's the marriage of these different considerations?
I would say, going back to something earlier, I don't see anybody thinking really aggressively about how to automate and speed up and create more resiliency on the app development side. That is still bespoke, sweaty work, full of mistakes, full of testing, full of a lack of automation. So I think somewhere in there, we've got to get better at creating more resilient, safer systems. And I do think AWS right now, the Amazon Stack, is very much focused on the data center level, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to see the same sort of thinking, the same sort of knocking heads on the app side. Right now, I build apps the same way I was building them 20 years ago for the most part, and I think that's kind of a mistake. It should be easier for me to build an app that doesn't fall over, right? And I think that's a real challenge. So
you should write your own JavaScript framework.
Well, that's the problem, right? Like I don't need another pile of code that I've got to.
We need another JavaScript.
Right? There's this webcomic I read called Not Invented Here. Yeah. And there's one episode of it where the guy is sitting there typing away. He's like, "Oh crap! I just created a new JavaScript framework." And then like later there says him like at JavaScript Framework Authors Anonymous.
I read that too. So like first I was refactoring, and next thing I know, I have a GitHub account.
or I've seen someone acquire the Simpsons cartoon, where it's like how many days since there's an injury, and they're putting a 0 up, and it says how many days since a new JavaScript framework.
But this gets to this whole issue of reusability, doesn't it? And isn't that what we're thinking about with Go to some extent?
It's how it's too easy to create these things, and so there's a different world there. The front end UI builder world, certainly the JavaScript world, they are sort of, it's become their norm that these things are moving incredibly fast, and I guess they're getting better or easier to build things, but it's still the back end world is much built on some much more stable abstractions that are evolving in some sense more slowly. But you're getting these more composable pieces.
Yeah,
right? You don't tend to retire APIs.
Yeah.
You kind of very often the old ways of doing things still work, even though you're building the new things. Whereas the front end stuff, you look away for a few months and your code doesn't work.
But I think also, yes, I agree with that 100%. I think the other thing is one of the things that we have to get better at is throwing away code. Right? It's like there's a lot of fungibility. It's easier to create something, but a lot of times we're not willing to kill it. Right? We're not willing to just let it die and let it go. So I think we have to get better at doing that. And I still have to go back to Alan Kay's stuff about he wants to be able to create something now and go back later, having learned something, and go fix that thing I did a year ago, and everything still works and everything is better. Right? This notion of being able to add some more flexibility or agility and all that. And I think there's a lot of infrastructure that's doing that. Like I could if I could take this out and put run CN or whatever I want to do, there's attempts to do that. But on the front end, I just don't see that. I just see starting from zero. Oh crap! I created
front end. So we kind of get fixated on pieces on sections of the world that are actually maybe not where the mainstream is. Right, the data center is there's all kinds of problems there, but there's a lot of stuff is now happening on public cloud where these problems, a lot of these problems aren't actually happening. You don't need to decide whether you're going to run Mesos or Kubernetes to make something work on AWS or Azure. You've already got whatever you needed to do that, right? Yeah. And then the other thing in the front end, it's like this JavaScript stuff is gradually, it doesn't really matter because it's real mobile first. What really happens is this Swift versus Android, or the iOS versus Android. That's where the real ecosystem is. That's the actual place where things are being built. And the desktop app, it's there, but the actual usage of it is becoming it's not the mainstream thing now. It's actually the iPad or whatever is the mainstream. The phone is the mainstream consumer device now, and you spend many more hours on that than most people spend many more hours on that than they actually spend on poking at things that are in.
But I'm even thinking about, so we're getting better at writing code faster and testing it and deploying it faster. So at some point we have to get better at moving faster without having to deploy it. One of the things we learned from the DevOps side is there's a whole bunch of ceremony I can get rid of. This used to be a really expensive activity. It took lots of people and lots of time. Now it's a flip of a switch and I've got power, right? I think we need to do more of that on the front end and on the middleware side. It should just be a flip of the switch rather than getting 7 people together and doing all this stuff.
Sometimes it can be. Just committing to your GitHub account and having it appear on Heroku has been around for a long time.
Yeah. It works with mobile web. It doesn't work with App Store processes.
Right.
That's a problem. You're all right, I'm continuously delivering to the App Store, and then it waits for 6 weeks to get approved.
Yeah, this is insane.
And there's nothing we can do about that ceremony. That's at the level of Google and Apple to fix,
or get rid of it.
Well, except there are some ways around that. You can have your own store now. You can use test flight. There are ways of getting stuff out in more limited ways.
Yeah, there's new ways, and you've got some other companies like Accenture or whatever, or PhoneGap Enterprise even, right? Well, they'll basically give you a little tiny container app that you can ship stuff inside of so you can update your code.
Yeah. But there's a point at which we'll spend more time shipping new apps than using the apps we have. We've got to stop doing that.
I don't know. Look at my iPhone. It's got probably hundreds of apps on it, and I use 20 or 30 of them. But I actually deleted all the other ones that I might want to use.
Yeah, they're all there. Still there.
Yeah, but how much bandwidth is spent updating them?
Yeah.
The classic.
And then when they update, they forget their login ID, and then I get frustrated and delete them.
And then you kill them. The famous phrase, the fastest network request is one that doesn't use the network, right? Mm-hmm. The fastest update is one that doesn't require deployment.
Now let's take a quick break before we get back to the second half of the show. Our show this week is brought to you by Pivotal. Pivotal has a portfolio of cloud applications including Cloud Foundry, Redis, RabbitMQ, and Spring. They are a steward of open source. Their mission is to modernize IT with agile engineering discipline. You can find them at pivotal.io. Now let's get back to the show.
We need to start thinking about doing stuff, making things better without having to, start from zero. I really do believe that. I really think that's a big frontier. I think we can do lots in that space, but that's hard work too.
Yeah, and it's a change in mindset too from the way a lot of mobile apps get built, just by a marketing agency.
Yes.
Right? And they're used to build it and ship it and then we're done, right?
Yeah.
And if we're going to do something else, there's a new contract and it's a new thing. It's a new app.
Yeah.
Probably because the reason it existed in the first place is over. It's a different campaign.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it isn't that we don't know how to change existing code. There's part of that, absolutely. But another part of it is just the way that the processes encourage us to work, the way that the world encourages us to work.
Again, gets to the heart of the difference in the kind of the different worlds, too. There's this definitely an ethos in the world that, is here at OSCON. It's about continuous development, continuous ongoing, community participation, participation in itself, right? versus what is marketing versus, very much event-based. It's like we get ready for a launch, we push the product out, we're done, now it's done, and that's a much different kind of mindset. And I think that's a mindset you see in the marketplace overall.
I think that historically it's been hard to get good UI development in open source. There's a lot of back-end products. There are frameworks, but if you look at the UIs for things that have been built, mostly not a huge number of good UI people working in this space, particularly in sort of infrastructure. Free monitoring tools are fairly crappy UIs, and there are a few exceptions, but it's visualization software has been a difficult point. So we're starting to see things like D3 is getting more used by more people to do more interesting things.
But isn't that the heart of information? That's what I was always confused with. Yeah. Isn't that the heart of information architecture, right? To be able to create something really beautiful that's super, super, super simple too. I mean, isn't that...
If you have great graphics art skills, you're probably not working in the back end building these things, right? So the problem is...
Shouldn't you be thinking through your information architecture in a way that so you can actually have this presentation layer? I mean, is that not... Am I totally naive about that? I mean, Apple does it so very well, There's such simplicity in their products that really does reflect...
lately?
I know. Well, okay. So
hardware products, 100%. Okay. Agree with you, 100%.
Yeah, hardware. Well, let's say just hardware then. It strikes me as something that I think that you're right. There needs to be a lot of work on. But I always wonder about okay, so if the UI is so bad, what does that say about what's underneath?
I think it's more about where the talents are of the people that are writing the stuff, right? If you're an infrastructure person, you've got a problem, you write back-end code that solves that problem, you put it on GitHub and you just invented Kubernetes or something, right? But the user interface, the front-end GUI for that, it is probably coming out of somebody is not coming out from somebody that's used to building very easy-to-use consumer apps, or gaming or something like that. Right?
Yeah, no, it's so common. A lot of just enterprising companies that they don't even have a UX or UI designer, right? What they've got is some developer who read Joel Spolsky's book on UI for programmers, and that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I think is starting to get better, and it's getting easier to build these things. And that's just looking around OSCON, we're seeing more interest in this kind of thing.
Yeah, IBM, there was a sort of a pre-con called Cultivate, which talked a lot about culture, and IBM decided to out their commitment to design. They talked about all the thousands of designers that they're hiring and the way they're trying to make design a more equal player in the iteration and in the same kind of open source culture that we do code in. So, and I thought, well, that sort of indicates that there's a gap, right? That we're actually outing this great initiative to make design a fundamental part of things. But I think that's a good indicator of what you were saying, which is I think we're seeing more and more of that. People are starting to sort of put those things together. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I missed Cultivate because I was teaching a 2-day workshop on microservices. I threw some culture into that.
I couldn't get into your 2-day workshop on microservices.
Yeah, I actually had a full room.
They sure did. They oversold that event. So it's very cool. It's very, very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Which reflects, I think, where, what we're talking about here. Open source is here, right? And a question I have about about Cultivate and the kind of topics related to what we're seeing with these new foundations and the heavy corporate involvement. Have you guys at all started looking at policies for companies and how they manage open source among their own employees, and where the lines of delineation are between I'm writing for my company now versus I'm participating individually? Because that's always been such a core part of the open source movement. It's that individuality.
Yeah, that's a topic that I get into quite a bit. I did an entire presentation about that when I was at Netflix for one of the open source conferences. Netflix approached it by basically doing a contributor agreement with the Apache Software Foundation at a corporate level, and then saying, okay, Apache stuff's okay, we know how to deal with that. If it's some of the license, we'll take a look at it. And then set up a GitHub account and then made it fairly easy, fairly low amount of process overhead to do that. But then you saw something just a few days ago. Capital One now have a DevOps dashboard. You should probably have take a look at that. Have some of the people from Capital One on one of these shows, because they fought through lawyers and systems and processes and practices, and just the work they've done to get that far is actually the product itself is quite nice. The fact that they have a booth here and they're talking about open source and they've built their own code. That some people are going, that's not bank, and you're giving away free open source software, and you're a bank.
We wrote about that.
Yeah, it got named by the marketing department, so nobody can spell or pronounce the name.
Yeah, well, I looked at their website, and I was like, EYEA or something, but it's spelled like
But that story has been amazingly popular over the past week.
Yeah, I heard from them 6 months ago that they were trying to get this thing out. It's that fighting through the system and creating a new practice within Capital One is what they're doing, and the other banks are contributing. There are consortiums of banks where they're contributing to open source for some of the fundamental software that implements banking. I think it's Symphony, I think is the name of a consortium, but there's a few people talking about that. Yeah. So it's just becoming pervasive how you do that. But the way you set it up, if you have to form a foundation inside your company to release code and you have to set up committees to do it, you're making it heavyweight for things that should be lightweight.
Well, then if you're making it heavyweight internally, does that make foundations by default heavyweight externally?
If you think that in order to do anything you have to create a foundation to do it, it slows you down. If I think the two...
So we're going to see a slowdown.
No, I don't think so. I think people are gradually figuring out that there are lighter weight ways of doing it. I think the Facebook talk yesterday was really good. They're doing tens of new projects a week or a month. They got 300 projects or something, and they've got a lightweight system that they just deploy stuff. And they're making it easy. If you just create a Hack Day project, you open source it. Netflix open sourced a whole bunch of stuff from its Hack Day project, the last few ones it did. And then today, PayPal was talking about inner source. So conceptually setting up a framework that looks like open source, but basically to provide a thing across the company where things are in that state. But I think Netflix and Facebook is a very similar kind of approach. The default, certainly for the platform code at Netflix, is that you should expect your code to be open sourceable. The default is, I'm probably going to open source this, so I should tidy it up, document it, make it a bit more separable and modular. It may never actually get open sourced, but there is an expectation that the default is that. I mean, there are some things that they decide that won't be.
Yeah,
but it's flipping that default is something that as that idea starts to spread, you're starting to find a change. So that's kind of what PayPal are doing as well.
Yeah, and that actually strikes me as leveling up on Amazon. Remember the sort of the story of the Amazon story is everybody's going to write code that we can all use internally, right? Yeah. So that was sort of the first step. Now we're hearing everybody's going to write code that anybody could use externally.
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of leveling up on that whole thing. It's not enough that we're using it. Anybody should be able to use it.
And you get better code that way.
You get better code. You're also forced to think ahead. Well, there's a whole bunch of things I shouldn't probably expose. There's a whole bunch of things that somebody I've never met might do. It sort of raises the bar in so many other aspects.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna take a position. I'm curious on your argument against it. Right? So the argument being that with these foundations, that you just have more people managing the innovation. You have an organization that's set up to manage the innovation. That just seems to create just a natural slowdown.
Yeah, I mean, it's designed. It is designed to slow down innovation because you're trying to create.
And so, why are these foundations such a good idea?
So, I think the timing of the Cloud Native Foundation was Google saying, "Okay, Kubernetes now 1.0, and we'll put it in a foundation." Right, so the 1.0 thing is signaling, okay, we now have something where we've stopped messing with it. There is some stability, and we're going to manage the evolution of that stability. So it is to slow it down. And with Docker, it comes back to if you're going to do standards body, you want rough consensus and working code. Okay, here's some working code. 1.0, or in Docker's case, we've kind of figured out what this base thing is. and we have rough consensus that this is a component that makes sense, and so people come in and join it. And I think that that's the timing. But yes, it definitely is to slow things down. And that was one of the reasons Netflix didn't want to sort of create a foundation around Netflix OSS, because Netflix moves much faster than most organizations.
Well,
and,
I think
you get this mismatch now between the people trying to consume your code and the people trying to build it, and
bingo,
it slows you down.
I think that's actually another role that these public foundations play is, okay, everyone else can catch up. Let's take a breather. Everyone else can kind of catch up. You can all kind of get on the bus. If we need to, we'll add a couple of more seats. I think that's kind of what's happening right now, which, again, goes back to sort of the market size thing, right? Like, so some of this, I think, is, wow, there could be a much bigger market if I could get everybody on board, right? I think in some of the cases, there's some similar ones that may or may not apply. The Node issue, right? So Node.js, they had a governance problem. And it got forked. Oh, that's a bad thing. This is not good for us. Let's get a foundation and try to get everybody back together, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if some of these are preemptive moves, or if that's really what's going on with Rocket and Docker. It's like, oh,
yeah, I think that's what happened with Rocket and Docker. It's like, we don't want you the way you're taking this. Yep. So we're and the way you're running it the way you need to run it, but we've got different needs.
Right.
And there's different views on either side of that, but that's fundamentally what it came down to. And after a while, they basically said, "Okay, we can agree on what the common needs are."
So the users
give a bit on either side and say, "Okay, we're going to have a common standard here."
Yeah.
Got just a few more minutes because I do have to run. But Donnie, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one point I would add to the slowing down thing is that's exactly not just the people to catch up, but that's what people building on top of it want in a lot of cases, right? Like developers don't want JavaScript land where you've got to forward port everything to the newest API or the newest framework every couple of months, right? I mean, like what I want to do is be able to build an application and then move on and build the next one and not have to go back and forward port the last one I built because there are other things I want to do. I want to be able to pick a framework and stick with it for, let's say, at least a year at a time, or pick an API and stick with it and not have it breaking backwards compatibility without, decent notice of it's like, all right, we've, marked it that it's going to be obsoleted in 6 months. You've got some time to port it forward. Yeah. Like people in, the rest of the world want to be able to not spend all their time refactoring. Right? Like, because they've got businesses to run and they'd rather be innovating and doing things for their customers than doing things with very little external facing benefit.
So we're just ending OSCON, and this is the last year it's in Portland for some period of time. It's going to Austin next year. And so this is my hometown, so I'm sad to see it go. But I'm just, it's been an interesting, it almost seems like an end of a mini era maybe, where now this seems much more like a recruiting show than ever before, where the effort is really to kind of get people into the company who know about open source, who know about these sophisticated technologies. I'm curious from each of you guys' viewpoint on your reflections of OSCON over the past few years, and what are some of the noteworthy things you'll remember, as we get ready for, Austin, in 2016.
I mean, open source is mainstream now. It's the way it's the best code. It's the most scalable code. It's also much lower costs. We're hearing about that with Mikey Dickerson's talk today. The U.S. government spending whatever it was, $80 billion on IT. That most of that's going into enterprise software and hardware, and they're unhooking it, replacing it with things that cost a few percent of that, and that's the GDS in the UK and in the US. The replacement systems are costing a few percent of what the previous systems cost. And that's great for the open source movement, but I start thinking about, there's a lot of people employed by that other, whatever it was, 90-something% that's going to the big enterprise vendors. What happens as their markets start to crater, right? That's a lot of people being employed. Where do they go? How do they move in? And we just have to hope that the sort of Jevons paradox of making it cheaper causes more to happen ends up just producing a better world that keeps everyone employed.
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that all of those developers at vendors end up at end user companies instead, right? All building software at all of those because it's all open source now and they can do it.
Yeah.
And hopefully, things like Capital One are sort of a bellwether for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things. I was thinking the exact same thing, and that is, that's great that we're disrupting or disintermediating these groups of people, but we have a big challenge ahead of us, not just in open source movement, but in computing in general. We're disintermediating a lot of jobs, a lot of people, and whether they become end users and consumers of product. That's a real challenge, I think, that we all need to think seriously. Another one, just totally on the Portland OSCON thing, so much of OSCON for me is Portland. I actually am really curious as to what it will look like in Austin. It's like I'm imagining, this will look very different. I'm really excited to see what happens in Austin. Because so much of OSCON for me is coming to Portland, and it's Portland tech, and it's Portland people. So that'll be pretty interesting. And I definitely see a change this year. I think you mentioned on the floor, there are a lot more companies that are involved in OSCON than I think ever before, which I think was actually a task for the OSCON committee. I think they're bringing more companies in, whether they're Capital One or Choice Hotels. I mean, you could just walk through there and you can see all these other companies. And that, sort of like what you said, I think that says, okay, so open source one is like, tick box, now we move on. And that moving on is, I think, going to be the stuff you're talking about, which is now there's lots of other jobs to do. Now that this part of that software is not interesting anymore, it begins to fade into the background as fundamental. We've got lots of cool things ahead of us. So I'll be curious to see what Austin's like.
Have blues instead of techno at the parties, hopefully.
Oh, yeah. I would love it. Yeah.
More country music and bull riding.
Yeah. Cowboy hats instead of Skrillex. Who knows what's going on?
I guess my feeling about it is that over the past several years, we've seen scaling almost emerge as like something that the Twitters of the world did, but it was a craft, right? Mm-hmm. And there was a craft that had a lot of interest, and it grew out of it, and it grew into something that really, I think, reflects this open source community that we have today. Which then to me says, and well, now it's not a craft anymore. It's a commercial exercise. And so my expectation is OSCON in Austin is going to be huge. It's going to be gigantic. It's going to be a really, really big commercial event. Because Austin has a much better infrastructure than it does than Portland does, for sure, and I think it's just going to be this is just, we're going to look back at these events that they say these are tiny events, but what we're going to see come is just a lot bigger.
Yeah, I spend a bunch of time in Austin. It's a really nice place. They have the Keep Austin Weird kind of thing. It's got that same quirkiness to it, and hopefully some of that flavor continues.
I think what we're going to do at the new Stack is we're going to have our event here in Portland at the same time next year. Launch our foundation.
Yeah, that's the new Stack Foundation.
That's what you can do. Very good.
Well, cool. Thank you guys all for joining us on the new Stack Analyst show with us, and we'll see you guys soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. Cheers.
That's it for this week's show. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pivotal. Pivotal is on a mission to modernize IT. They have a portfolio of applications which include Cloud Foundry, Redis, RabbitMQ, and Spring. They're a steward of open source. You can find them at pivotal.io. Audio editing and sound design for the new Stack Analyst podcast is provided by Broken Hours. You can find them at brokenhours.com. Thanks again, and hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.